Welcome friends to another Dune video. Today we cover the Sardukar, their origins and their campaigns. We're going to look at Sardukar content from the Dune Encyclopaedia, from the original classic Dune novel by Frank Herbert, and for the prequels to that novel written by his son and Kevin J. Anderson. And this is a compilation of previous videos released, put in order and made to show the strengths of the Sardukar and their tactics.
Seleucia Secundus is a harsh world, a jungle world. There was a tribe there called the Sardau, and they were a warrior tribe who favoured the strong through rituals, trial by combat, endurance tests and raids on other tribes. This whole process starts when you are only 6 years old. You then start daily instruction on how to fight with a knife, sparring matches till you draw blood, and develop timing, technique, and combat reflexes. After puberty, death combat begins. It's formal and between two single people, and if you win the contest, you are blooded and had passed the first stage of initiation. The unfit were killed at an early age, the strong remained. You can see, much like the Fremen, the needs of the tribe were the priority over the one, the individual. Conflict between the sexes was not allowed at any age. If you lived past puberty, then you became a wife or a concubine. The Fremen, by contrast, allow both men and women to fight. Children between 8 and 12 would face survival tests twice a year, in midwinter and midsummer. No rescue party would be sent out for them, and the child would have no knowledge of the skills they may need. This lent itself to two outcomes. The child would return alive or would be dead. In your first year after puberty, males were sent to Skull Reach. This area had the harshest heat on the planet, but over 90% of those sent returned, showing how strong the trials earlier in their life had made them. When they return, they are made full warriors, and they could join the raids on the other tribes. They had learned at this stage swordsmanship, animal riding, unarmed combat, and basic tactics. The leadership of the tribe fell to the most capable military leaders, and as their strength grew, so did their size, until over time the tribe became a planetary empire, a nation. During its expansion at first, every member of a tribe was killed, but over time they were allowed to join the ranks of the Sardau tribe. Through a custom called the Circle, any warrior, down to the most junior, could, after an action, critique his commander and prove they could have achieved the objective quicker. If they did convince those people, they were chosen as the battle commander for the next action. This replaced the trial by combat. This would ensure senior but less capable leaders would be replaced with those who had a better military genius. The Fremen maintain a challenge through combat for their leader to ensure they continue to be the best person for the job. This tough and ruthless force was hired by House Megara. They conquered House Megara. The fanatical Sardukar, then using captured ships, seized a wide area around Megara, but due to the slowness of space travel at this time, the Landsraad had time to prepare for their attack, and the result was a stalemate. But it did have the effect of forcing the great houses to negotiate. It was judged the Sardukar would win, but it would leave the empire a graveyard. So instead, there was the Treaty of Corrin. The leader of the Sardukar became the first Badisha emperor, Shusut Carino I. Some houses did not want to sign. One such was Jansin, so the emperor unleashed the Sardukar. They were prepared for a long fight, the Jansin, but well-placed guerrilla teams paralysed the planet's communication and transportation, stormed military barracks, and assassinated or captured high military and political leaders, all within a few days. Up close, the Sardukar had concealed weapons, shiga wire in their hair, which could be used as a garrote, and a fake toe or two could be installed with stabbing weapons. The final assault on the shocked capital left no defenders alive. Later, when certain houses took exception to the Emperor's supremacy on the voting board of CHOAM, CHOAM controls all economic affairs across the known universe, and those houses joined the Lishash Confederation, which then attacked Sardukar ports and outposts. Long prepared, they achieved what they wanted, but suffered high losses. They captured a few Sardukar leaders, a rare thing. They tried to sell them as hostages, but the response was 4 words: let them drink blood. In response to this, some leaders tore out their throats with their fingernails, and the rest died attacking their captors with no weapons. Henley sent Sardukar to recapture the lost outposts. They did, and took no prisoners, and then attacked the planets of the Lishash Confederation and routed its armies. Lishash itself was the first to fall. Its major cities burned, its rulers executed, its citizens dead by the sword. The Lishash Confederation begged for mercy, but this did not come until the Landsrat commander, who fought with the Sardukar with his own forces, asked them to stand down, which they did, but more because they were caught between the will of the Landsrat and the Lion Throne than the demands of the Landsrat army's leader. After this, expansion by the Corrinos became a relief valve for the Sardukar. It kept them sated and ready through fighting in different terrains and against new adversaries. The myth became they were invincible, and their origins on Seleucia Secundus as a tribe were forgotten. It instead became the Emperor's prison planet.
Count Shuset Ekovit, who took on the adopted name of Corrino after the military victory there, wanted to maintain the position of his house by getting a clear victory over the other houses in the Landsraad. The Sardukar, of course, gave him an advantage. At this point, they had never been bested in a land battle, but were at a disadvantage in space. The Count's fleet had been assembled, ready for the occupation of the planet Glarus, which was an important planet due to its richness in agriculture. A Bashar in the Emperor-to-be's forces, Abulard Harkonnen, learned of the Emperor-to-be's plan and shared this with the Council of the Landsraad, betraying him. But the Count did not know of the betrayal at this point, so the Landsraad Council were waiting to ambush the Emperor's forces between his target Glarus and Seleucia Secundus. The Landsraad forces, knowing the deadly reputation of the Emperor's Sardukar, wanted to meet them in a space battle. But the Emperor's intelligence services were as good as that of the High Council, and he was ready for the Landsraad's supposed ambush. With his Sardukar transferred to combat ships, he surprised the Landsraad ships and plunged his forces directly into their ambush spot. The terrain of the space battle is very important here. A collision, which may have been caused by an illicit mining and smelting operation, occurred in times before the Guild. The resulting debris, comprising dust and hot gases, as well as solid bodies, filled the Sigma Draconis system and is still in a highly agitated state. This means that the fleets, whilst they engaged, were limited to low velocities due to the environment more than tactical considerations. Torpedoes were also affected, and the shields on the ships. I assume this is the Holtzman field being infected by the environment we've just discussed. Due to the shields failing, you would think the lasguns would become more effective, as they could be used without the explosive reaction that occurs when it meets the Holtzman shield, but this was not the case, as the lasers were often diffused or deflected by the debris. Also, with the ships moving slowly to strike your enemy's shield, it would be very difficult to get to a relatively clear distance from the random area the explosion from the shield would cover. it would be a calculated risk that might destroy your own ship. The terrain also limited the navigators, who could not keep up with the shifting changes in the landscape around them. The best tactic in this place, and dangerous in normal circumstances, was to match the vector of an enemy vessel, get close, and use an intense lasgun barrage to allow a boarding party. As part of his ambush, the Emperor-to-be appears to have seen this. His undefeated terror legion, the Sardukar, could be unleashed. The Landsraad carried very few personnel trained to fight hand-to-hand, and those that were not up to the standard of the Sardukar. Once they were able to board a vessel, the Sardukar quickly secured it, and then the Sardukar turned the Landsraad vessels against their own forces. At the end, 3 surrendered whilst another 11 escaped. On the Emperor's side, 2 of his ships and 5 of the captured Allied ships were blown up. The one that belonged to Bashar Abulad Harkonnen fled early in the engagement. He was stripped of all his wealth and cast into exile for his cowardice by the Emperor. And now we move to a slightly different section where we look at the Sardukar and how they operate in different tactical situations. First, we will look at their recruitment. Prison ships drop out of the guild highliner and fall towards the planet. This is from the book. Even from space, Lucius Secundus looks gangrenous, with dark scabs and a cloud layer like a torn shroud. The convicts would have a 60% mortality rate in the first year living on the planet. After release, the prisoners live out their own lives on the planet, the toughest of them keeping on living. Beasts are imported by the Emperor to the planet, laser tigers, solution balls and others to help test the prisoners. The planet could be made better to live on. Corrin knows this, but he wants the planet to remain as it is, a place of punishment for any who defy the Emperor and his will. And for another reason. Recruitment is the other reason. The Sardukar attack a group of soldiers at an isolated ruin. The prisoners had barricaded themselves inside. The Sardukar had attacked with all their skill. They wore full-body shields, used flamethrowers and primitive weapons against the convicts. The battle was one-sided, obviously, but carried on for hours. The Sardukar fighting at points hand-to-hand against the toughened prisoners. The prisoners were largely slaughtered, but a few had managed to take down a few of the Sardukar, taken their weapons and prolonged the fight in the process. Those final men, the toughest of the prisoners, were holed up and ready to die. And then the Sardukar used a stun bomb. They had moved behind barricades, and then a pulse of intense light had gone off. This light was coupled with the force of a Holtzman field, and the few survivors amongst the prisoners were knocked out, allowing the Sardukar to get inside. Days passed, and now some of the survivors, wearing tattered clothes, trained, and around them the Sardukar did too. These prisoners were now new recruits into the ranks of the Emperor's terror legions. The Sardukar were in a human grid line of regimented men. Around the perimeter of that grid, weapons and heavy equipment were placed at specific points. The soldiers were to be newly blooded. We now look at an example of the Sardukar assassinating a noble. A noble lady from Bela Takuza is in hiding, and the Sardukar are after her. She sees 3 ornithopters with searchlights approach, and they land in her planted fields, and the Sardukar exit the thopters, and she thinks of when she had met her husband, who conflict had separated her from. A commander amongst the Sardukar shows his ranking insignia and chops his hand upward for his men to take up their positions. The lady meets him and gives her false identity. A soldier sits her down with a word and a wave of his lasgun. The commander held up his hand to silence
the soldier, and the lady recognises the tactic. One soldier to intimidate, the other to pretend to be on her side. The commander says he's looking for members of a renegade house. The commander steps up to the lady, and she does not move. Her hall mask did not match what he had been told to look for, but his hand snatched away her necklace, and her false face fell, and behind him the Sardukar continued to come off the thopters and search her farm. A Sardukar grabs her arm and cuts her with a curette. That's a surgical instrument for scraping biological tissue. It's analysed, and her identity is confirmed as the renegade Lady of Ix. Oma appears with a hunting weapon and tells the Sardukar to let her go. Some target him, others stay on her. Death was near, but she felt no regret, and then all the Sardukar opened fire. Here we see how well organised and surgical the Sardukar are, from searching whilst others speak to the lady, to how the two speaking to her fall into their interrogation training without needing to discuss it. An assassination attempt is made on the Emperor, from the Emperor's half-brother, who challenges him. He is holding a glow globe, not the best weapon against the Sardukar. Shaddam wants him taken alive, and the Sardukar approach the half-brother with clubs and blades out. The pretender makes an adjustment on his glow globe, and a beam comes out. A Sardukar crashes into the Emperor's chair, saving his life. The pretender avoids the Sardukar's fire by hiding behind props laid out for the ceremony. Then the pretender, who is called Tyros, swings his laser and slices it towards the Emperor, but the burst sputters out as the power goes. The Sardukar surround the man, and the Emperor is moved behind the Imperial box to safety, and the pretender is arrested. We see here the Sardukar's ability to follow orders, even when their Emperor is in danger. They sell possibly their own lives to take this man alive in the middle of the battle, when it would be easier to just kill him. Now we see some of the people involved with the assassination attempt pay the price. A Sardukar slays another prisoner in front of the Emperor. The larynx and trachea had been ripped out, a Sardukar's speciality. The jongleurs that had been performing when the assassination had taken place had amused the Emperor by begging before he allowed the Sardukar to dispose of them in vile ways. Shaddam had also falsely blamed 5 rivals of his for all the plot of the assassination, removing them as threats to his throne. The Viscount Grumman's influence and messages of disruption was hard to tame, so the Emperor planned to use the ambassador to send a message. The Sardukar marched him into the town square, and at a signal from the Emperor, the man was executed by a soldier with his lasgun. His body was sliced in half from crotch to crown. The supreme Bashar, Zum Garon, then marches Tyros into Execution Square so he could give no speech before his death, as others had been allowed to do. The doctors of the court had sealed his lips with surgery, and Shaddam announces he will kill this pretender personally. A purple beam strikes the man in the chest, leaving a bloody hole, and the Emperor ensures the body is charred further afterward. Shaddam says, "When you challenge us, you speak out against the entire Imperium. Thus, the entire Imperium must observe the consequences of your folly." He then indicates for the Sardukar, who together fired more, cremating the body of Elrud's bastard son, half-brother to Shaddam, further. The lasguns vaporized organic tissue and even bone, leaving only a smear of black ashes, which swirled in the thermal currents and finally blew away. That description's from the book. Then the Sardukar escort the Emperor into the Imperial Palace. In the last part, we see a lot of the Sardukar's savagery, not unfocused but harnessed. They could have dispatched the first man in a cleaner way, but it seems to be part of the way they fight to cause terror with their methods.
For this next part, we're going to look about the occupation of the planet Ix, how they treat the native population, and what happens when they come up against Duncan Idaho leading Atreides troops to free the planet.
A worker on Ix comes before a Sardukar commander who twists an ear till it draws blood. The worker says the prince has returned over and over. That would be Prince Romber Vernius, deposed leader of Ix. The commander continues to strike the worker, cracking bones till he dies. The commander's eyes were feral. The Sardukar on Ix, at this time, have been given a synthetic spice that made them savager than normal. Commander Garron goes to find more people to torture information from. Before he can put that into action, the alarm sounds. They are under attack. The Atreides fleet drops through the atmosphere and hit the Sardukar defences, takes out their grid and then descends into the canyon. Bombs go off, planted by rebel Ixians. This knocks off the Sardukar's sensor nets and installations. This killed the surface-to-air guns, and then the Atreides ships launched explosives, melting armour plates and blasting rock. Such had been the length of the occupation. The Sardukar had lost their edge. They have been focusing on suppressing the people of the planet for so long. Duncan Idaho led a fleet who arrived on transports. They landed, swords drawn for shield fighting, meaning lasguns could not be used. They cry the names of the Duke and his ally the Prince, and the battle begins. The rebels faced Sardukar, forming into regiments and firing flechette needles. Body shields protected some of the rebels, but a lot of innocents were also hurt, showing the Sardukar's lack of care when they are in combat for innocents. The rebels used a suspensor platform to get higher. The Sardukar fired, causing the platform to tilt. 4 rebels fell to their deaths, but the platform under Gurney reached its target, the Grand Palace. Despite them being a little soft, the Sardukar are quickly recovering and hurting the invaders. On another level, Duncan Idaho led the Atreides against the Sardukar, who take some of the fake spice and run into battle like animals. They were outnumbered. The book tells us, at close quarters, shields crackling, they discarded their long-range weapons and charged into the Atreides force, using well-timed knives, swords, and even bare hands to penetrate defensive shields. Each time the Sardukar subdued one of Duke Leto's fighters, they disabled his shield and ripped him apart in an instant. Despite the extra savage edge they have from the spice, their training is still highly effective. Commander Garron went into Duncan's troops. He used a Kinjal dagger. He pierced eyes, severed jugular veins, and simply ignored the Atreides' assaults around him. A brash Caladan lieutenant slipped in from the side, dipped the point of his sword through the commander's shield, and stabbed it into the meat of Garron's shoulder. Here we see the advantage the Sardukar have. They become reckless, but as we will see in a moment, they can also fight on despite injury. Garron ignored the attack and plunged into the melee, the spice feeding his frenzy. The Sardukar then moved forward with no formation, a primitive attack style, but still deadly. The Atreides begin to buckle. Duncan Idaho shouted and held up the sword of Leto's father. Leto's men pushed forward, hearing Duncan, but the wild Sardukar did not give up ground. They refused to quit. Duncan saw no end to the battle, and the Sardukar rallied again. More Sardukar troops joined the fight outside. They ran forward, screaming, pure and simple. Here we see their resistance and how hard it is to break one of their brigades. Despite this, slowly, the Atreides and the rebel Ixians began to take Ix back, section by section, but the Sardukar fought on, ignoring pain or nasty wounds. They showed no fear. One dragged an Atreides fighter down to the ground, and using a hand switched off the young soldier's shields and then ripped out the soldier's throat with his teeth. Seeing they would never stop, Duncan changes strategy and, in the Atreides battle language, tells his forces to head for the Grand Palace. The Atreides pulled back from the savage Sardukar and formed a phalanx, a group of warriors standing in close formation. With Duncan at the head, Duncan struck at any Sardukar that came near. They went from the admin buildings, and the book tells us, a lone, defiant Sardukar soldier, his uniform torn and blooded, stood in the middle of a skyway bridge that spanned the open grotto. When he saw Duncan's men charging towards him, he clasped a grenade to his chest and detonated it, blowing up the bridge. The attack takes the objective away from the enemy, but I don't think they would take out the bridge in that way normally, were they not so driven by the synthetic spice. Duncan looks for another route and wonders how he can fight men like that, and finding a way, they enter the upper levels. The palace is wrecked inside. He comes across Gurney and Prince Romba fighting the Sardukar. With Duncan's forces, the battle's fortunes turned, but more Sardukar under Corrin came, covered in blood and firing weapons. It seemed to be a suicide attack. Corrin sees the prince and attacks him. He has a blade in each hand. Duncan steps in. Duncan crashed into Corrin, striking him on the side. Their body shields collided like a thunderclap, with a momentum exchange that hurled Duncan backward. But the impact also diverted Corrin, who staggered towards the gaping hole in the window wall, slipping on debris on the floor and plunging ahead. Deflected from his target, the ravening Sardukar commander went wild. Still charging, seeing a chance to kill more of his enemy, Corrin collided with 3 shouting Ixian rebels who stood too close to the edge of the smashed balcony. He spread his arms and, like a bulldozer, he swept the astonished victims over the precipice. Corrin went over the side too, but he managed to grab a broken, protruding girder. Prince Romba, seeing Corrin and knowing he was the son of the Supreme Bashar of the Sardukar, reaches out to him. Corrin snarls and says he would rather die and does not want to see his father in disgrace. The prince, despite this, grabbed him. Corrin drew a knife and slashed, but struck the metal tendons of Romba's wrists. Duncan came to help. Corrin attacked again, cutting through the cyborg hand, and he fell without a sound. And from there, the Atreides forces secured the Grand Palace, and Romba, with the aid of the Atreides, would secure Ix once again. We see here their dedication to the mission. Corrin could not return to the Supreme Bashar, a failure, and if not that, would rather die.
For this next part, we go back in the timeline from the scenario we just saw, and we look a little deeper into how the Sardukar handle the people already on Ix, and what will happen to them if they try to rebel against the Sardukar's rule.
First we visit Sater, an Ixian rebel fighting against the Tleilaxu, who occupy his planet on behalf of the Emperor to produce a synthetic version of the spice. He hears footsteps approaching, and moments after, the guards stationed as lookouts shout, and then one ducked inside to avoid whoever was starting to shoot at them. Some think they have been betrayed, and then Sardukar arrive, supported by the Tleilaxu. They come into the tunnels through the 4 exits, blocking an immediate path of escape, showing their knowledge of the terrain and how in sync they are trained. They then fired at the Ixian rebels, acting like it was a shooting gallery, and the book records that screams, smoke and blood filled the air. The Sardukar then closed on the rebels and draw hand weapons. Some, just as deadly, fought with fists and fingers. Sater picked his moment, waiting for the rebels to fight back and defend themselves, and he and a companion used the one means of escape left to them, a holographic wall. This looked like a solid rock wall. though he didn't want to be the only one to use it. It would leave the Sardukar too suspicious if all the rebels disappeared, and heighten the risk of one being seen entering the cover. Then he hears cries behind him, as the Sardukar have quickly discovered the secret tunnel, the other rebels doing little to slow them down, and Sater goes to an old bolt hole, thinking of how close he had come to discovery. Now listen to Prince Romborovics speaking to his people, asking for their help to throw out the occupiers. Perhaps fearing its effects, the Tleilaxu shut his speech down, but the prince still believes it will have the desired effect, and so the Sardukar are sent out to quell the rebellious populace. They shout out orders that everyone must return to their homes. Speakers pump out their message to many that martial law has been declared, and there will be a crackdown on people straight away, driving it into the people to obey. They also state rations will be halved and shifts increased. These orders have been issued by the Tleilaxu many times before, perhaps showing that they are not being effective, that they are not being listened to by the people. Sater believes as the workers are squeezed, they will explode into rebellion. Next we travel with Kando Garon, who leads the Sardukar troops stationed on Ix and guides them with a voice projector and speaks in the Sardukar battle language, allowing no others to know his orders, but for them to clearly reach those they need to. Some, including Sater, were guided into a holding area where they would be questioned, but amongst those being herded by the Sardukar, Sater hears people whispering about Romba's declaration and felt it had been worth it. The Bene Tleilax begin to find and remove conspirators, and the Sardukar did the rounding up in full uniforms, no longer hiding their involvement. Prisoners terrified were flanked by them, whilst the Tleilaxu masters drove them forward. It's announced they were sentenced to death for acts of sabotage. They were driven to the edge, a balcony by the Emperor's blades, and then they were sent over the edge, and the crowd scattered as they fell, and cried out in terror, but the ground answered their terror with silence. As their threats and beatings are not working here, they try to up the stakes in what the populace see they will do if they are not obeyed. Earl Dominus Vernius of Ix watched, and thought how he had spoken to the people from such balconies, praising and thanking them. The balcony the people had been thrown from was that of the Grand Palace. Shots could have to be heard, and the sizzle of lasgun fire, the Sardukar enforcing their order on the angry populace, and then after, further punishments are announced. Ration reduction by 20%, and productivity must not change, or further punishments will be given out, and the populace is told those who turn in rebels will be rewarded, driving a wedge into the people when the prince's speech had taken hold on them to unite them. And in the final section we're going to cover here, we hear Shaddam IV as he addresses the Landsraad, and a heckler during the speech is descended on by the Sardukar. Their orders are not to draw blood during the Emperor's speech. After was a different matter. Almost like a twisted sign of respect to him, the Padisha Emperor is speaking about the actions he made against two houses, and that if the law is broken, action must be taken against those who break it. He gets a hologram brought up of the planet Bekel. The Sardukar had dropped imager drones to show the scourge that was there. The Sardukar have blockaded the planet to ensure it was not spread by people trying to leave, showing the Landsraad the power the Emperor can draw upon with the Sardukar. The Sardukar had been sent to investigate an illegal spice horde, and during the planet's panic, 2 ships carrying biological matter had been spilt by the people of the planet, hurting their own planet, unleashing the scourge.
In this next section, the Sardukar go down to the planet of Caladan in an effort to wipe out the nobles of the Landsraad that have been plotting against the Emperor, or so the Emperor thinks. Leto is amongst those people because Shaddam does not know that Leto has infiltrated that group to bring them down from within. And just add a little detail here, it's not specifically the Landsraad, but a group of nobles within the Landsraad called the League of Nobles. Paul is acting Duke at this time whilst his father is away. What choices will he make? Friends, let's find out. Alarm sounds inside the castle. Military vessels, the Sardukar, are coming. Paul looked from the ramparts at Kala City spaceport. Paul could hear the ships tearing through the atmosphere, hundreds. Paul thought of the other noble families that had been wiped out by the Emperor, who was now trying to remove the thorn of the League of Nobles from his side. Gurney says they cannot withstand the Sardukar invasion. Duncan says this is the best and worst kind of training for Paul to have. The shields are activated around the castle, but Paul worries about the citizens outside of it. After, they go below into the command centre within the castle to hear the Sardukar, but nothing comes through, as they make no announcements of their approach, ask for no flight paths or landing permissions, they simply land. Gurney sends the Atreides forces to strategic positions to meet them. Paul says they have to convince the Sardukar his father is only working with Jason and the League of Nobles to bring them down. Gurney says Shaddam wants to send a message written in blood. Thufir says with analysis first they will level the town and spaceport, and then we, referring to himself, Paul, etc., will be helpless behind the shields. Paul remembers his father's message, a farewell to him. Hoping against hope, this might convince the Sardukar. Paul says to issue a message that he will talk face-to-face with the Sardukar commander. Outside the castle, he could hear explosions and screams. Paul looked for the message spool, but found it had gone. The commander they faced, Colonel Bashar Kolona, had been against Leto up to a point. Leto's father, Paulus, had hurt the Kolona family and caused him to be recruited into the Sardukar, the Emperor's Blades. But since he had seen the heart of the man and seen what Leto had tried to do to right the legacy against his own family, the Cloners, and so Chapati found it hard to believe what he heard about Leto and his current actions, even though he was ordered to attack Caladan. Kolona's fleet washed over the small city spaceport like an ocean storm. More than 100 troop carriers sat down on the landing fields and even in public plazas of the quaint capital town. Uniformed Sardukar emerged from the carriers, wearing body shields and carrying weapons, prepared to carry out a massacre, just like on Kuate. It dismayed Kolona to see how many of his comrades were grinning with glee at what they would unleash. His fighters swarmed into the spaceport control tower and the terminal facilities, taking hostages, replacing the controllers in the operation centres. He received reports that soldiers in the town had already slaughtered 100 civilians who foolishly tried to defend their homes. The people of Caladan seemed recklessly patriotic, not intimidated by Sardukar. They must be mad. Kolona's heart was heavy because he knew the Emperor wanted him to lay waste to all this, just as he had down on those other planets. The story then jumps to Yui, who had Paul's message, his salvation, in his hand. He'd taken it to protect himself and his partner, who were under threat from the Harkonnens. As the envoy ship came to speak with Paul, some patriotic Caladan people tried to protect their duke, but the Sardukar crushed them. Paul says to drop the shields, as it will only delay the inevitable if the Sardukar attack. And then he speaks to Kolona. Kolona says Leto has joined the radical movement under rebel leader Jason Aru. Paul explains his father's motives, but Kolona says things cannot stop without evidence. Paul offers to speak to a truth-sayer. Kolona says there is no one with them to fulfill that role. Then Yui joins them to say he had the proof that Paul wanted. Paul questions why he had it, and Yui just says it was misplaced with good intentions. The message to Paul is played, but Kolona says it's not enough. The Emperor was significantly angry. Yui shows a second message Leto has recorded. Before leaving Caladan for the infiltration, Leto had dispatched a message for the Emperor in the form of Gurney Halleck, but it was intercepted, and briefly returning to Caladan, later recorded another message. So as things turned dire, it could be used. The Bashar listens, and Thufir says an attack now would go against the code of the Sardukar. Kolona says, with the evidence, it brings into question if the Duke is a rebel, and that he knows Leto's sense of honour. The Bashar finishes with, given this new information, my orders are subject to change. The Padisha Emperor commanded us to eradicate all rebels, and it is no longer certain that Leto Atreides is truly one of the rebels. Few Sardukar officers would be receptive to such new information, but I have personal experience with your father. I know his sense of honour. His past actions do not match the Emperor's assumptions or accusations. I must bring this new information back to Kaitan and seek further guidance from the Emperor. Of course it will be checked for authenticity, but I suspect it will pass any tests. Then he leaves. Duncan and Gurney look at Paul in new admiration, while Thufir Howard nodded to himself. The Mentat spoke to Paul. Young master, you took a risk in facing the Sardukar down like that. I'm sorry I doubted your decision. The Duke will be quite proud of you. We next look at the Sardukar in 3 different scenarios, the first one of which is taking down a smuggling ring.
As the planets prepared to evacuate, Sardukar in attack thopters arrived. Flying low, they dropped concussion bombs which made fractures in the frozen walls. Lasgun beams broke the cliffs into pieces. This unleashed the ice in the walls and sent boulders tumbling down into craters. And then the thopters dived like predators into the chasm, and there dropped more bombs to take out 4 parked transport ships. What strikes me here are how well prepared they are in terms of knowing the terrain, and how relentless they are faced with this enemy. One man rushes into a thopter and fires up its engines. It lifts up and the weapons become hot, but before he could take a shot, 2 Imperial ships blew him up. Sardukar troop carriers landed on the ground, and they came out with lasguns and knives. With great accuracy they slagged Dominic's heavy hauler, and the family atomics the Sardukar thought were aboard were stranded. The banished Earl knew his smugglers would never get away. His troops ran, firing at the Sardukar. The Sardukar slew every smuggler that came up against them. It was like practice and gave them enjoyment. The smugglers are clearly not on the same level as the Emperor's troops here. Jordan retreated into tunnels, and his men set up crates as barricades to defend that position. A blast from a Sardukar lasgun removed the head of Jordan. Dominic had one chance, a desperate one. The troops were the Emperor's, and Dominic of House Vernius could strike a blow against the Emperor with them as the message. The Sardukar's fire began to bring down the walls of the chasm. Dominic moved inside his base with some of his men. The Sardukar came into the facility with attack formations, cutting down any and all opposition. They really come across here as the Emperor's feared force, unstoppable. This type of mission is perhaps where their reputation will have come from. Dominic's men promised to hold the Sardukar as long as they could, and Dominic entered the armoured storage. When he did that, an explosion afterwards trapped him and some of his men in there, but it would not stop the Sardukar. They would cut through the barrier in minutes. They had him their mission to complete. Dominic chose a stone burner, which could destroy an area of his choosing. He set it to only destroy the base. There was no reason to use it to destroy all of Arrakis. The Sardukar got into the vault just long enough to see the remaining time on the stone burner, and then, as the book says, then everything went white hot. Such is the dominance of them here, their opposition sees no point in trying to fight them on their terms. It's more about using the Sardukar as a statement against the Emperor. Here the Sardukar attack a house to take spice that they are holding illegally. The Sardukar arrived at Corona as a show of force, and the vessels fly towards the artificial moon. Supreme Bashar Zum-Garon tells the planet of House Riches that they have melange stores that are not documented, breaking the law of the Landsraad. He ignores the planet's responses and tells them to prepare the contraband for him. Battle frigates entered the moon, receiving bays. Those inside tried to seal the airlocks, but the cruisers simply blasted the hatches away, letting the life inside spill out into space. Claws then forced open the sealed hull of the moon. The Bashar gave a warning if they found enough evidence that any remaining person on the moon would die. The Sardukar entered the facility. Those who worked inside ran for evacuation ships. The Sardukar is split to search quicker. A man pleads for more time to evacuate. The soldiers opened fire. A scientist says the Recessian mirrors there are of vital importance that can give power like a small sun. The Bashar says they can be saved, but where is the spice? And so the scientist tells him. As the moon is to be blown up by atomics, the scientist is then later told he cannot leave with the Sardukar, as it's illegal for a civilian to be on board a military ship. So the Sardukar claim the mirrors and the spice. We see them here using their authority to take things that might benefit the Emperor, and possibly themselves as well. The Imperial ships moved away, and then the atomics devoured the moon. It looks like a firestorm from the ground, and within days, the retinal damage done blinds a quarter of the planet's population. In our third and final scenario, artificial spice is used to poison a guild navigator, and this brings it to the attention of the Emperor. The Sardukar fleet is sent in, and when the defence satellites detect their approach, the planet's alarms go off. The Prime Magistrate sends private forces to form a defence network around Bikali. The Bashar tells the planet they have been placed under siege as they have stockpiled melange. The head of the house needs to confess or prove his innocence for the blockade to be lifted. The Sardukar fleet moved slowly towards them, applying pressure. On the planet, they discuss how the melange stockpile has already left the planet. The fleet entered orbit around the planet, but did not engage. They would blockade the planet and stop any vessels getting down to the planet. And they waited. Here we see between the Sardukar's forces and reputation, they can bring an entire planet to its knees. As in our world, where armies might stop people leaving a town or castle, applying the pressure to limit food and other vital resources to get what they want. Now scale that up and think of the same idea being applied to a whole planet.
Next, we're going to examine the Sardukar from a slightly different angle. This time it's through the viewpoint of Duke Leto Atreides. So we're going to look how he interacts with them.
Leto Atreides was invited by the Emperor as a member of the Landsraad to a planet called Atorio, but he missed Caladan. This place would be the Emperor's planet museum. Leto left the Guild Highliner in his space yacht. He had only a pilot and a few retainers with him. The Emperor's complex was built to celebrate 10 millennia of Corrino rule. He attended from duty, not ambition, Leto did. Leto thanks his pilot, who is called Arco, and they discuss the route down to the planet, and that Arco will have time to buy a gift for his family. After landing, Leto explored the museum. Sardukar patrolled, showing the importance to Shaddam of the gala. A man darted into the narrow service passage where Leto had stopped and did not notice him. Then the man brought out a screen, and Leto saw images of the discarded dump boxes and cargo retainers in orbit. Lights suddenly winked on in the great dark hulks. As the stranger closed the screen, Leto confronted him. The man ran, and the Duke loses him, and is found instead by Imperial troops, and nicely ordered to attend Shaddam's reception, which Leto does. We then turn our eyes to Shaddam, who's speaking with the Sardukar, who confirms that the guests invited have been vetted, and he greets many nobles, does Shaddam, as the afternoon goes on. His ally Count Fenring appears and notes that many Chome people invited have not come, including the president and his mother. Then Shaddam is greeted by Leto. They exchange pleasantries. Leto mentions his suspicions, and Fremen calls Colonel Bashar a Sardukar to hear Leto's concerns, and the Sardukar then leaves to investigate. Later, Shaddam addresses the crowd. As he was set to speak, the tower is plunged into darkness. Leto could see this had spread out into the city itself. Then, holoprojectors came on. Sardukar went out to organise and protect the guests from whatever was happening. Then the hollow figures began to speak. They are all of the same person, Jackson Aru, who speaks of overthrowing the Emperor, the Emperor. The Sardukar tensed, and the speech ends on a threat to the nobles if they survive the night. Shaddam roars that the Sardukar have to find that man. Colonel Bashar returns and says Leto's findings are verified. There is a plot against the throne. He then explains the dump boxes and heavy debris in orbit are not empty, or at least not as empty as they appear to be. They are loaded with inert mass and explosives, making each of them a huge and deadly projectile, and 3 of them are on a direct descent to this museum. That is its target. The Sardukar urgently evacuate the Emperor on hearing this. Leto thinks of all the ships on the landing field and how many people might get away. The lights suddenly came back on. The Sardukar get the Emperor and take him, the Empress and Count Fenring to a discreet exit point, but Shaddam pulls free. He does not want his people to see him as a coward. The Sardukar tells him they are in the impact point, but they have a ship to escape on ready. Fenring listens and moves towards the door to escape. The Sardukar clear the way of the noble guests. As the book tells it, it is as if they were part of a sports competition, so they are being moved by the Sardukar rather brutally, I would imagine. Leto says they are there as invited guests. They all have to be evacuated. Leto goes to the public address system, which was ready for Shaddam's speech, and tells everyone they need to evacuate. A Sardukar triggers an alarm. Leto thinks the impact of the materials from orbit would be like a small atomic going off. Shaddam asks that the Sardukar also makes sure his truthsayer gets to the roof and escapes. His truthsayer at this time is the Reverend Mother Gaius Hellam Hyam. Leto then thinks of his pilot Arco and the others from Caladan that had come with him and are now doomed. Such a big contrast here between Leto, who thinks of the men he travelled with, and Shaddam is happy for the Sardukar to push his guests aside and only wants to stay so he is not thought of as a coward. Who would you follow in this situation? It's at this moment a Sardukar actually grabs Leto and says, "This way." It's Colonel Bashar, and they rush towards the exit door. They reach the roof, get into the ship and leave. The Sardukar, who had served Corrino, at least some of them, stay behind to stop other nobles escaping and slowing the Emperor in their panic, giving their lives in the process, the Sardukar do. Leto sees the museum complex below and sees a few others escape, for which he is glad, but wishes he could have saved more. The Sardukar, Colonel Bashar, says he will not hear Leto's objections about him escaping with him. Leto says, "You said the Emperor ordered it." Bashar says, "I know the Emperor's wishes." In other words, it was his wish rather than the Emperor's. The officer then fell silent as they streaked higher. Leto says in a response to the Empress about the orbital accuracy of the strikes, the kill zone from so many explosive high-mass impacts will extend for dozens of kilometres. They do not need to be pinpoint accurate. An orange ball burns through the sky. They impact and wipe out the Emperor's supposed new city. The light seared through Leto's eyelids, thousands of lives lost. Leto thinks of Paul and Jessica. Down below, the blazing light rippled outward. The city complex was a molten scar. "Breathe easily, dear cousin," Shaddam said to him. "We are safe." Leto turned back to the window port and stared at the rising Holocaust. Leto later takes time to visit the family of his pilot Arcos on Caladan and attends the man's funeral.
In this section, it's mostly going to be given over to how the Sardukar interact with the Emperor that they are there to protect.
Ships moved down to the surface of Elegir, imperial ones, marked with the scarlet and gold shades of House Corrino. This was a show of the Emperor's force. They would make sure that the planetary governor would cooperate in flushing out the violent rebel leader, Jackson Aru. Colonel Bashar Kolona was not convinced he was there, but the Emperor hunted down all rumours without mercy. 10 troop carriers would bear the Sardukar to the planet, all under his command. On their approach, they did not file a flight plan or ask permission, they just flew. By being who they were, they forced commercial traffic to move out of their way. Kolona had no need to issue orders, and just watched the training and the actions of the Sardukar take shape. The Viscount had been issued a demand to meet the ships at the spaceport, and Giandro Tull would need to cooperate. The gunships landed, the troops disembarked, synchronized in their movement. The gunships' weapons were ready for any orders. The Viscount was there to meet him. Kolona and his 30-strong honour guard wore personal shields. They were carrying various long blades and short daggers, and throwing knives. Giandro had only advisors and asks why they are there. Kolona says to find rebels against the throne, something the Viscount disputes. Kolona says his troops will look over the planet where the rebels might be hiding and then conduct any necessary interrogations. I can only imagine the horrors the Sardukar will inflict on the populace to chase down these possible rumours, and the ruler can do nothing about it. The book says his soldiers swept out like flechettes from a scattershot weapon and descended upon the Elegir capital, chasing down whispers and gossip. There was a banquet set up inside, but Kolona was left unimpressed. He would normally eat nutrient rations, meaning he had no palate for a banquet. The Viscount offered to show the Sardukar his horse, which would be traced all the way back to Earth, its bloodline. Kolona says that the Sardukar have no need to ride beasts, and that this visit was ordered and is not a social one. The Viscount perhaps is trying to woo Kolona to show how rich he is, perhaps working to a bribe, but he's soundly put back into place, and perhaps here the Sardukar who guard the Emperor will have been used to seeing impressive displays of money, something that the Viscount couldn't do in comparison to Shaddam. Pressed, Kolona then gives some of the Emperor's suspicions. He's asked about the noble house he put down, but does not speak out against the Emperor. After he returned to the Emperor's court, having found nothing suspicious, he refused to fabricate evidence, though this may disappoint the Emperor. Kolona has had a certain code that we do not see in a lot of the actions the Sardukar take, though they do not have loyalty to the Emperor, of course. Perhaps this is from Kolona's time in a minor house. He is surprised to see a Baron Malay with whom he has a history. Kolona had come up with the Sardukar, and they had both been assigned to Kaitan. The other soldier had let his training slip, and had a dalliance with a concubine of Baron Malay, hurting the rich Landsrad family and ruining his career in the Sardukar, and creating instability at court. This shows, even though the majority will follow their indoctrination, the odd Sardukar does not. We do not know what happens to him as punishment, but I don't think you can leave the Sardukar, especially when he will have caused issues in the Emperor court, without a fitting to them punishment. Later in the plaza, Kolona keeps an eye on both Shaddam and his Empress. A large-scale hologram of Shaddam is projected, and it talks of being proud about how the Imperium has joined together to restore itself after the nobles had damaged his treasury. An Imperial treasury ship flies above the crowd with commemorative coins inside. Kolona checks nearby and finds no poison gas canisters or explosive devices or other threats to Shaddam. And it was then that suddenly the Emperor misspoke, saying not to believe his lies, not the words Kolona knew had been agreed upon, and he saw the Hollow no longer followed what Shaddam was doing. I see here that the Emperor's words will have been agreed before for security, or just to ensure that he gets the desired reaction and effect from the crowd he's speaking to. Kolona ordered the evacuation of the Emperor, and as the alarm sounded, other Sardukar raced to the balcony level. One officer tells Kolona that the hollow projector has been hijacked. Kolona reaches the balcony where the Emperor is. The crowd is confused and tells the Emperor he should go to the emergency lift, which leads to an armoured chamber, but the Emperor wants to stay for the false message to be shut down so he can speak to the crowd. Kolona, seeing the treasury ship coming closer, begins to drag the Emperor. Shaddam is worried about being seen as cowardly by people. Kolona ignores this and moves him along, the honour guard clearing the way before them. Shaddam says he will have Kolona killed for this. The Sardukar position on personal security was clear. Not even the Emperor could go against these priorities, or their priorities. A wall panel was moved aside ahead of them, and doors to a lift opened. Kolona made sure the Emperor and his Empress got in, even before himself, and the Sardukar came in behind him. As he activated the lift, the ship above exploded, and the coins carried inside became projectiles. And flames hit the balcony. The lift dropped, but was reached by flames from the exploding ship. Shaddam is angry, but not at the attempt on his life, but the loss of Solaris. He was going to give the people, and now he fears they will not believe how generous he is. Kolona observes that will be the foremost concern to anyone else.
Next, we continue our examination of the Sardukar Colonel Bashar Kolona, and we look at his family's personal history with House Atreides and how that shapes his thinking.
He stands before the Emperor's throne, making no movement, but remained internally alert for any danger. There would be no threat to Shaddam on his watch. Nobles from the Landsraad come into the area before the Lion Throne. Kolona saw each person was after the empty seats in the Landsraad, the holdings they did not have. The Colonel's own great house had been thrown down some time ago in a scheme devised by the then Emperor Elrond and Duke Paulus Atreides, both fathers respectively of the current Emperor and Duke Leto. Shaddam's father convinced the Atreides to launch a surprise attack on the Kolona homeworld. Members of his family were killed, and so Kolona, his father, and brothers were forced into hiding. Not giving up, Paulus had hunted them, and Kolona knew now, after serving as one, that Paulus had been aided by the Sardukar in Atreides uniforms. Kolona and his brothers were then taken to Seleucia Secundus to be trained and recruited into the ranks of the Sardukar. Echoes here of the Harkonnens being aided by the Sardukar, dressed as their men in Dune. His ties were to the Sardukar, but he did not forget what had happened, but hid such feelings as he served. All that remained of that act were House Corrino and House Atreides. We see despite his reasons to hate the Corrinos, he still has loyalty to them and sets the emotions aside to fulfill his duty. The Emperor had begun to see traitors everywhere. Some nobles wanted the Imperium broken up and out of his grip. The Emperor held his word on them, but made a private list of threats against him. When the Duke Leto had found out about his father, Paulus Atreides, who had unwittingly, it turned out, taken part in the attack on House Kolona, had not wanted the tainted holdings given to him from it. So Leto had instead given the holdings up to distant relatives of the cloners who still lived. This complicated the Bashar's emotions. And with that evidence, seeing what Leto did, the Bashar did not believe House Atreides was involved in this new rebellion. The Emperor sees one threat in the speeches of Trum Vishon, who talks of planetary rights over imperial rights. Kolona has mixed feelings on the Emperor, seeing him as both cruel, from when he executed his own brother to take the throne, but also he had seen kindness from him when he went out with Princess Irulan to feed beggars. This breach had notified the Sardukar as well to tighten up security so beggars could not get close to the Emperor again. I love the detail here, how even the beggars are seen as suspicious and a potential threat. Later, Colonel Bashar Kolona was before the Emperor, who ordered a strike force to be issued against Duke Verdun when he has returned to his homeworld to wipe out him and his family. Kolona, perhaps thinking of his own family's loss, says to the Emperor, "Some of that house are very young and likely blameless." But the Emperor insists he wants the bloodline exterminated. Later, the hold of the Spacing Guild ship was used for deployment of the Sardukar on this mission. It was, as the book tells us, hundreds of Sardukar warships, battle equipment and soldiers. We do see Kolona question the decision of the Emperor here, an interesting wrinkle in the Sardukar's relationship with him, though he does ultimately obey. This mission was a challenge for Kolona, the biggest force he had ever commanded. He had led small forces during his training and been second command on larger missions. Here he would make a point for the Emperor against hidden traitors in the Landsraad. This house's holdings would be left in ruins. Kolona was standing in the command module of his flagship. His ship led the way down to the planet below. Tactically, they approached from the night side. The Duke, along with his family, would be asleep at this time. Kolona was the sort of soldier who would share the danger with his troops. If they lived or died, he would share the same fate. They were his family now. Kolona orders his troops to activate their shields and stay alert. I read about at least one other Bashar who fights amongst his troops and with them. This was when the Sardukar were trying to keep hold of Ix when they were being attacked. So perhaps this is common, like ancient Greeks with their leaders or strategos fighting amongst the phalanx. It might be needed for the other Sardukar troops to give the commander respect. Kolona had mixed feelings over the Emperor's orders, although he would carry them out, but he knew innocent people would die in the assault. In the sky, the Sardukar were weapons hot. Kolona issued no warning that people could use to evacuate. The book gives some details of this conflict. His gunships unleashed explosives, destroyed buildings, drew down a curtain of fire. Troop carriers landed, armed, merciless soldiers, not worried about wearing Imperial Sardukar uniforms now, and suicide drones filled with explosives that flew into their targets. Soon the family's palace was in flames. Kolona took in the details of the Sardukar's damage. He saw the Duke's daughter fall to her death as the tower she was in's walls fell onto her while still burning. He was proud of the efficiency of his team. Any attempt by House Verdun to take off was shot down, and they were defeated. From a tactical perspective, I like the mentions here of giving no warning or indication of their approach, so they can fulfill their mission as set out by the Emperor and leave none alive. The Emperor would soon announce the Duke's fate. It was a brutal message, but the Emperor felt a necessary one. Colonel Bashar tells the Emperor about the mission's success. In Frank Herbert's Dune, the Fremen are portrayed as highly versatile and hard to outwit enemies, even when they fight against the Emperor's Sardukar legions. How do they keep the advantage? What lets them defeat the Emperor's troops? The Emperor's troops who have helped House Corrino rule the known universe for millennia. Friends, let's find out. The perception of the other organisations in the Dune universe, such as the Sisterhood and the Emperor's forces, are that the Fremen are small groups of people who live in the desert, have little use of technology, hide from giant sandworms, and have no more ambition than to live through their harsh lives and die. Those perceptions are wrong. We're going to go through brief examples from the first book and then touch on what strengths that the Fremen show during those passages.
a group of Fremen and a Mentat are being hunted by the Sardukar forces of the Emperor in the desert. A Fremen uses a bat to carry a message to another group of Fremen. The message is received, and what the Mentat Thufir Hawat sees as an inept band of Fremen move out over the dunes. As this happens, an ornithopter comes carrying Harkonnen battle colours. They swoop over this inept band, and after being signalled, land near them. 5 Sardukar warriors emerge from the ornithopter with personal shields. They have been travelling under the disguise of House Harkonnen, not wanting to give away the Emperor's involvement in the affairs on Dune. The Sardukar approached the Fremen in an enclosing half-circle. Sun glinted on blades. The Fremen stood in a tight group, ready to meet them. Then the sand-sprouted Fremen. They were at the ornithopter, then in it, and as the dust settled over the two fighting groups, only Fremen remained. The Fremen signalled with a flag, and more Sardukar came to crush them on a large troop carrier. The carrier settled, its shields down, as lasguns had been used in the area. When a lasgun strikes a shield, it creates an uncontrollable explosion that could harm a few or a large number of people on both sides, so the two are rarely mixed together. Then, over the sand, came the stolen ornithopter from before. It crashed into the carrier, causing an explosion and destroying the carrier completely. What does this show us? It shows the Fremen can give messages in a way that might not be expected by the Sardukar warriors, whose tech will not work in the desert, or at least not well. The Fremen have adapted and use a creature to bypass that issue. Then the Fremen, natives of Dune, lure out the Corrin warriors, who do not know enough of the Fremen to recognise when they are acting weak and clumsily, and then they show their use of the desert to hide and ambush the warriors and take the ornithopter. The ornithopter is then used to take out a troop carrier that, with the ambush exposed, might have wiped out the Fremen there. These are extreme kamikaze tactics, and this shows how extreme the Fremen are willing to go to win. The Fremen might also surprise the Sardukar with their knowledge of technology, being able to fly the ornithopter so easily, for example. In Dune, the houses that rule the universe are bound by the Great Convention. Part of this is not to use atomics against other human beings, atomics being essentially nuclear weapons. Paul, towards the end of the books, needs to break through a shield wall to reach and crush the Emperor and his forces and attain victory. So he uses the atomics, but is smart enough to not break the convention. He uses them against the wall, but not the people. This shows the change in the level of tactics. The access to Paul and his family's atomics give the Fremen, who would otherwise struggle to match the destruction the Emperor could call down against them. One of the most powerful weapons the Sardukar warriors have against the Fremen when not in the desert are personal shields. They only allow slow projectiles to come through and reject anything else, thus why close quarters fighting is still used in Dune. For an example from our world, a bullet would be stopped by the shield, but not a slow dagger thrust. Then, calling on the desert power his father had spoken of before his death, Paul uses the storm, once the shield is down, to have sand pushed through the breach, and there the static charge that is unleashed will destroy every shield barrier in the camp, removing one of the biggest obstacles the Fremen would face. Through this breach, the Fremen ride giant sandworms in a wedge attack, hurting the Sardukar, until the Fremen dismount, and the Emperor's warriors then show they know how to fight with knives. I assume they also don't have the shields, due to the static. Taking out the shields with the charged particles show the tactical understanding the Fremen now have under Paul, who as a duke's son has been trained to fight since he was a child. Then the native sandworms that are thought to be very dangerous and hard to kill and wild are finally seen by the Emperor's legions to be anything but. The Fremen can not only control them, they can ride them into battle. So you see, they continue to surprise the Emperor's warriors with this new, deeper grasp of technology, And with what we saw in the first scenario, the lack of understanding of their world hurts the Sardukar warriors. This is due to the Fremen's secretive ways, and this is how the Fremen rose to defeat the Emperor's legions, and under Paul Muad'Dib become his ruling force in the universe, as the Sardukar were to the Padeshi Emperor Shaddam IV.
The battle in the city of Arakeen has already begun. Colonel Kolona was there, helping spring the trap on the Atreides. He rode the armoured dropship through the atmosphere as it debarked from the hold of the guild ship. He could already see the bombardment beginning to destroy the city. Then he was racing through the streets. His aim was to reach Leto's residency. His men launched explosives to take care of any organised defences, and Kolona, as the house shields fell, thanks to the traitor inside House Atreides, had been told by the Emperor that he was to make sure that Leto had a clean death, and Bashar had said that he would see to this himself, and his forces met the Atreides guards. Kolona recalls Leto's father making a power play that hurt his family and caused him to be a Sardukar with the loss of his house's power. The Atreides troops had shown his family no mercy, and he was stuck in a prison complex on Seleucia Secundus. He and his brother fought, and they survived the Sardukar training, such as having nothing to help them and having to find shelter and fight the planet's bloodthirsty predators, then having to do it all again with knives. He lost his brother during the 2 years of ordeal, and the clone became all that was left of his family. In the Duke's residence, with his shield belt surrounding him, in a comforting home, Kolona threw himself upon the Atreides captain, his Kinjal dagger raised, whilst his opponent defended himself with a long sword. Their body shields sparked as they crashed into each other. The Atreides captain managed to slice his arm with the sword tip, surprising Kolona, and then the Atreides' shoulders surged forward. Kolona deflected the next blow and slid his Kinjal dagger through the man's shield and between the man's ribs, and his soldiers dealt with the Atreides. And he thought back to his training, how he became one of the Emperor's elite guard. Life was a little more comfortable there, but there was an awareness with the nobles around him that could go away at any moment, and it is there he first sees Leto of the House Atreides, the house that failed his. He hears Leto say that he'd been looking into his father's records, and that things were not done by him, but the then Emperor Elrud, and he offers Borhi's back to the heirs that are still around, though not direct descendants. Back on Arakeen, Kolona was surprised with how many of his men had been lost to the Atreides troops. Once he had locked down the residency, he would deliver the Emperor's message about who would kill Leto. Around him, military aircraft cruised across the skies through a maze of smoke columns. Booming rumbles echoed from the fringe of the city, where heavy artillery, archaic weaponry deployed by the Harkonnens, pummeled hideout cliffs in the shield wall. At the residency's far side, he saw a lone figure fighting three opponents. Duncan Idaho. In precisely controlled strokes, he dipped his blade through the body shield of the nearest Harkonnen fighter and gutted him, then withdrew. With a Kinjal in his other hand, he stabbed the Sardukar in the kidney, a mortal wound. The Sardukar stumbled, unable to believe the death blow he had just received. Kolona froze, and the other Sardukar cried out at the fall of one of their own. In efficient fashion, Idaho dispatched the two remaining Harkonnen soldiers and drove back the second Sardukar, then bolted for the Harkonnen ornithopter. Kolona and the rest then went after Idaho, and one reached the ornithopter. The man grabbed for the struts and clung by his hands before flailing and falling back to the ground. Kolona takes a launcher to bring it down. Idaho performs evasive manoeuvres. Kolona targeted the ship and launched the projectile, and missed, just. The aircraft's running lights went dark as Idaho disappeared into the curling smoke. Kolona handed the launcher back to the uniformed man, who stared at him in silent disbelief. Both the Atreides and Sardukar had codes of honour. Gesturing towards his men in Harkonnen uniforms, the Colonel Bashar marched them into the residency for one last encounter with Duke Leto Atreides, and then he reveals that he had missed on purpose. Today we will look at the climactic battle from Frank Herbert's Dune between the Emperor and his Harkonnen allies holding Arakeen, Dune's capital, as Paul and the Fremen plot to take it and Arrakis as a centre of power back. Spoilers for Dune throughout, let's get into it. Paul and Stilgar, through a slit in the shield wall, a mountainous feature that protects the city of Arakeen from the planet's storms, see the temporary housing for 5 legions of Sardukar and the Emperor. Paul took one final look around through the telescope, studying the plain, with its tall ships, the gleaming metal houses, the silent city, the frigates of the Harkonnen mercenaries. Stilgar tells Paul the Sardukar they captured and released is going to the Emperor. The storm has tied down the Thopters that are housed out near the Emperor's houses and the Harkonnen frigates. Gurney mentions the fleet in space as a source of danger, but Paul says, "We can destroy the spice. The Guild dares not risk that." Paul discovered that by placing the Water of Life, a liquid taken from a drowning sandworm just before its death, above a pre-spice mass, it would kill the sandworms that made the spice. Gurney then tells Paul he's worried about the atomics being used. Paul says, "The injunction, it's fear, not the injunction that keeps the houses from hurling atomics against each other. The language of the Great Convention is clear enough. Use of atomics against humans shall be cause for planetary obliteration. We're going to blast the shield wall, not humans." Stilgar says he never knew the Fremen in the city could be completely trusted. Paul says the test of a man is what he does, and they will teach them to escape their bondage. The Sardukar have pushed the city Fremen from their homes to hurt Paul's forces with refugees, but have instead stoked hatred for the Imperial forces. Paul says he will use them as shock troops. Gurney counters that they will be slaughtered. Paul replies that every Sardukar they kill will be one less of his own forces. So in his own way, Paul is using them like the Sardukar were, pawns for his battle. The Sardukar they released has arrived now. There is a field around the landing area, so he must have warned the Emperor about what was going to happen as planned. Paul is told the Sardukar and Harkonnen patrols are pulling back. Stilgar confirms this is because the sand will spill into the basin, reducing visibility, and that this will affect the Fremen the same. Paul says his people must set the sights on the ships to knock the nose off each before visibility drops, so they can shoot as soon as the shields have been destroyed by the storm. Paul pulls back the south wall observers and shouts to Gurney, "Now!" It seemed that a full second passed before they felt the ground beneath them ripple and shake. A rumbling sound was added to the storm's roar. The wall was breached. The storm was entering the city, and the Fremen gunners were taking out their targets. Paul thought of the storm sweeping across the basin, the static charge within the wall of sand that destroyed every shield barrier in the enemy camp. I think this is why they released the Sardukar earlier, so the Emperor would get a warning and put up the shields, so the storm can then knock them out. With those shields up, once the storm had passed, perhaps there would be a danger otherwise of the shields coming up and hurting the Fremen plan. Paul and the Fremen retreat from the storm and seal off the tunnel, and it is then Paul hears through a communication that there has been an attack on Siege Tabba by Sardukar, that his baby son Leto is dead and his sister Alia captured. He felt grief, a shell without emotions. Everything he touched brought death and grief, and it was like a disease that could spread across the universe. He could feel the old man wisdom, the accumulation out of the experiences from countless possible lives. Something seemed to chuckle and rub its hands within him, and Paul thought how little the universe knows about the nature of real cruelty. The voices are from the other memory Paul has access to as the Kwisatz Haderach. It allows Paul to access the memories of all the men and women who were his ancestors. Dust poured into the city. The Sardukar fought with the Fremen as they emerged from the storm, and then, through the haze, the mouths of sandworms could be seen. Fremen, riding them, cut through the melee fighting and moved towards the Emperor's housing. The Sardukar were awed by the sight. The Fremen leapt from the worms' backs, but the Sardukar were hard men, trained soldiers, and so they faced them to buy their Emperor time. But the Emperor was made to retreat back to his ship. With the city of Arakeen in his grip, Paul and the Fremen meet the Emperor, and Paul says he will destroy spice unless the Emperor abdicates, as many who need it look on. Paul is challenged by and kills Fade Routher, a Harkonnen, and then Paul agrees to marry the Emperor's daughter, Irulan, and take the Lion Throne.
And now this last and final section is a little summary of the strengths of the Sardukar, what allowed them to support and defend the power of the Emperor for so long.
The first is their committed brutality. So yes, the Sardukar use a lot of weapons, from the better known lasguns, throwing knives and daggers, to even flamethrowers, which they use to, in quotes, help their own men train. But their best weapon is their brutality. We see whilst defending Ix from the Atreides, even when they are injured, they fight on without fear, dragging the Atreides soldiers to the ground, and one Sardukar uses his teeth to rip out his opponent's throat. Another example, they execute a prisoner by ripping out their larynx and trachea for the Emperor, and we are told this is one of their specialities. Something like that must take much grotesque honing and practice. We also have several examples of them fighting without weapons, but just using their hands to kill, even when other Sardukar do use weapons, such as swords and daggers. They are committed to their tasks, no matter what they must do, to their brutal crusade like few other soldiers, such as ending their own life with a grenade. Here it stops Atreides' forces crossing a bridge. And by way of another example, we turn to a quote from the books. At close quarters, shields crackling, they discarded their long-range weapons and charged into the Atreides' force, using well-timed knives, swords, and even bare hands to penetrate defensive shields. Each time the Sardukar subdued one of Duke Leto's fighters, they disabled his shield and ripped him apart in an instant. The next element that aids their reign as the Emperor's blades is persuasion through terror. Now, part of this is their reputation, the fear they have built in the Imperium over time. We see them fight aided by that in terms of others' reactions to them, and they reinforce it by their actions. But there are two examples I think really illustrate this point, and I'll bring them to you now. When the Sardukar are faced with workers striking on Ix, they reduce rations and say that the slaves' work must not lessen or further punishments will be given out. This shows their unforgiving nature, even when it comes to those that are in slavery, and how through the fear they give out and the reputation this enforces, the edict they have given will hold and be effective on the poor captives of Ix. Then we have another side to them, where they are unleashed on a planet's capital. The capital is called Elegate, and they are sent out, as the book tells it, to chase down whispers and gossip. You can only imagine the brutal force they must use to find out what the Emperor wants, and I think even them turning up will loose many tongues. And finally, there is preparation. In the first Dune novel, Paul says to check the Sardukar captives. In his words, remember too that each has a false toenail, or two that can be combined with other items secreted about their bodies to make an effective transmitter. They'll have more than one false tooth. They carry coils of sugar wire in their hair, so fine you can barely detect it, yet strong enough to garrote a man and cut off his head in the process. So even when they are captured and stripped of their weapons, they still have deadly hidden surprises, showing their planning in covering many potential situations they could get into through their sheer experience possibly. When the Sardukar raid rebels on Ix, they are able to enter and move through the rebels' territory, the areas that they control, due to their knowledge and preparation, or they raid a planet in Thopters, drop bombs, and use a lasgun to unleash stored ice and send boulders crashing down into a chasm, and then wipe out their enemy's transport ships with more bombs. Think of that precision, coordination and information involved that all lead to the strike happening and working. That is their third point of strength. They will of course have the benefit of being close to the Emperor and having much funding from him to do whatever he deems necessary so that he can maintain his grip on the Imperium. So those are the three strengths I think define the Sardukar. What do you think? Why does there always seem to be such an interest in them? Comment down below.
And with that part, friends, that concludes our compilation video on the Sardukar. Do you have any questions? Anything you don't understand? Anything that I might have missed? I think I've been pretty comprehensive, but you never know. Drop me a comment down below.